So I think I do have about 30 minutes, and it's quite a broad subject, so I will be passing some slides very quickly. There's a lot of buzzwords in our modern economy. One of them is the Internet of Things. Another one is, of course, artificial intelligence. And everybody may have a different opinion what these terms mean. And so I will not try to make a final definition on what artificial intelligence is, but I will try to shed some light where it all comes from and how it plays together. So the Internet of Things is a development of the Internet. In the old times, it was us communicating with other people, and now it's devices communicating with other devices. It may be on a very, very simple fashion. So whenever you pass a bus, your cell phone, or if it's in London, your Oyster card will communicate with the bus. So that's the Internet of Things. Things are talking together. And that was only made possible in the last maybe 10 years with the very quick and rapid developments in data processing. So it needed better technology in sensors, so that has evolved a lot. And the storing and the processing of data has brought new possibilities. So that's the Internet of Things. Thousands, millions, billions of devices are constantly talking to each other, exchanging information, and that offers lots of opportunities. So it's cloud computing that is also adding to the possibilities. Most information is now stored in the cloud, not on a server, which enables to store much more data than it was possible in earlier years. Another important technological advance was advances in connectivity. Now we're already talking 5G. So even if you're on the move, as it is in our busy lives always the case, data processing is not really an issue. It may be costly, but it is possible from a technical perspective. But if you take simple communications between devices a little bit further, then you advance the possibilities to an extent where things are already getting smart. So when we are talking big data analytics, another buzzword, I would say that's something that theoretically every human could do. So if you have the resources, if you have the money and the time, you can have 100 scientists reading millions of pages of scientific literature to conclude on a very specific thing, to find some keywords on those billions of papers. But this will make, even with the smartest readers and scientists, it may take decades to do that. And computers can do that just much faster. And that's, I would say, that's not yet artificial intelligence. It's just the advances that technology offers. But if you take it one step further, that possibility that you have with modern technology gives you also insights that you also, with all human manpower and time, you would never get. So you have an eagle view on, let's say, on the entire knowledge that is distributed on Earth. Theoretically, it's not yet happening. And you can link knowledge that you have, for instance, on a particular disease that is just detected in a tiny little village in Africa. You can link that knowledge, that particular missing link that you were looking for, with a hospital or a researcher in Japan, and suddenly he gets the information that he was looking for. So, and that is simply impossible if you just use manpower. Computers can do that, and I mentioned that's still the theory. Of course, there are lots of obstacles. There are regulatory obstacles to do that. You have different systems to record data. You have interoperability issues and all that. But this is taking the thing a notch above, and then it gets smart. Then we are entering the field what I would call artificial intelligence. And I tried to, I didn't even bother to make a positive definition of artificial intelligence. I can give you a negative definition what artificial intelligence is mostly not. And it has some anecdotal value to me because it's, it comes from my father, who is he's a retired engineer. He's totally into technology. It's his pastime. So when I joined IBM from 8 years in private practice, he said, "Now, ultimately, you do something good." And I said, "Well, was it meaningless what I've done so far?" "Well, Alesch, it was just the law. Now you're going to a technology company. That's where it's happening." So he's totally into technology. And now he's retired, he gets older, and so he's even rapidly developing into a technology geek now that he has so much time. And he told me, "Well, look, I'm on my daily walk, I run across an artificial dog." I said, "What?" "An artificial dog." So he took me for a walk to introduce me to his new friends, that artificial dog. And so we came to that garden, and there was a dog running by. Obviously not an artificial, and a real one. And then he told me, "This is, of course, a real dog." I said, "Yes, of course." "So where's the artificial?" Wait. So then we met the house owner, and he asked us very politely, "What were you doing?" And my father eagerly said, "Well, I would like to see your artificial dog that I see every day." And the house owner says, I don't have an artificial dog. But my father had explained to me before, that dog can move his tail. I said, "Okay." But otherwise he doesn't move. I said, "Okay." And he has a fur. I said, "Okay." Well, that was for him an indication of artificial intelligence. Then he challenged the house owner, "But I took pictures of your artificial dog." And the house owner said, "Well, my dog is natural, but he just doesn't move a lot." So bottom line is, after my presentation, or maybe even during my presentation, if your neighbor doesn't move a lot, there are three options. Yes, it may be a robot, but maybe not. It could also be option number 2. Somebody falls asleep during my presentation, or somebody's really focusing on the presentation. I think it's always the 3 possibilities. And at this moment, I would say option number 1, that it is a robot, is not very likely. So, but then what are the elements of artificial intelligence? So it's collecting, storing, and processing data. So it's automated thinking, that's already made possible. It's constant thinking. The computer, the dog, the artificial dog, never sleeps. It's controlled thinking. It's just a human sitting behind and still controlling. So we are still having control. It's application of knowledge and skills. It's empirical learning. It's cross-linked thinking. It's developing new possibilities and opportunities. It could be decision-making. That really depends. For instance, my employer, IBM, we're not developing AI that is decision-making. So we consider AI as a tool. It's a tool for humans, so they can use it in order to enhance their own decision-making. But it's still the human doing the decision. But I think from a technical perspective, it is already possible to have artificial intelligence making smart or not so smart decisions. So I just read today in the news another study on self-driving cars. It's that old story, that's a very difficult ethical problem. What should a car do, a self-driving car, if it has the very difficult decision whether it should drive into a crowd, maybe with elderly people, or just drive into a wall, and maybe some passengers are kids. And so I think, these are ethical questions. We don't have the time to go into that, but I would be very, very concerned if that is solved with a computer program. But it would be possible. But I think, and obviously, depending on the culture, the outcome of the programming and of the result would be very different. So what people would consider an ethical decision in some areas of the world may be very different from other areas. But what it is, you can solve very complex problems. Now, the two last bullets that I have here, awareness, even consciousness, not for the time being. You may all have watched a couple of years ago, many years ago, the Terminator trilogy. So remember Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2. He was being asked, when he just killed one of his opponents, he was being asked, why did you kill him? And his response in Austrian English was, because I'm a killer machine. And that is awareness. It is a clear indication of self-consciousness. But that was back in 1991, and we're not quite there. So we'll see. So my point is, AI, at least from my perspective, and that luckily corresponds with my employer's perspective, is a tool. And we prefer to call it cognitive systems. It's a tool, and I think the most important thing to remember from that slide is the gap between accountability and responsibility. So the car, or the artificial dog that bites someone, may be accountable for the incident, but it is still a human behind that tool being responsible from a legal perspective. So if I take IBM's Watson technology, that is just a brand of IBM's AI, the most well-known and the most branded and the most marketed, but in many occasions, in particular when it's research projects, IBM also does tailor-made artificial intelligence products on the premise. So there are lots of different opportunities and possibilities, but the most important elements are natural language processing, then textual, video and image analytics, and then it's machine learning, and you are always generating hypotheses. So you think something could be a solution, you feed some data into the cognitive engine, that's how we call it, into the machine, the magic box, and you're constantly testing that information towards the reality. Maybe you have already the answers, so you can measure the accuracy of these processes and get to advanced insights for certain problems. Now let's go into some IP stuff. And so before I do that, a brief word on the business model of modern tech companies, at least the ones that are similar to IBM. So in the old days, we have been a server and software selling company. So we sold computers and software programs to our clients. Later on, we have become a services company, and we are still a services company. So the business model was IT services, acting as your global electrician against money. And now we have evolved into a cognitive solutions company. We're still doing everything else, so that's still part of our business model. But we offer to our services our computer programs, our algorithms that can be fed with data that comes from our clients in order to realize new insights, for instance, into someone's business processes. So you may have a company in the biotech sector looking for some new insights into their processes, and by linking their data, maybe with publicly available data, and maybe with competitors' data, if you have such type of agreement, you may come in, you may get new results and new insights. So that's one of our new business models that we are exploiting. And from a, typically we do deals. So whenever there is a new deal in that field, you have to think about what is happening. What is this transaction all about? So who should own the rights in the data generated by the AI or the IoT devices? You should be mindful of obtainable IP rights, and we will discuss that, I think, also in Doris' slot. So who claims IP rights in the data? Then ownership rights in the information derived from the data, that's another thing. Should one reserve the right to transfer the data? We may have multi-jurisdictional issues. And then the question is whether an AI system can create a copyrightable work. Is the device data copyrightable? Other IP, I will get there. So the contracts should be clear. For the time being, I think the law solves many questions, maybe not all of them, but if you're not 100% sure, you better deal with that in the contract. So this is a patent law conference, but computer programs are largely protected by copyright, so I will also have a few words on copyright. So if you look at the protection of the AI as such, the important distinction to be made is between the algorithm and in the continental European law regimes such as Switzerland, France, Germany, the algorithm it corresponds to the idea versus the software, which would be the expression of the idea. And the idea itself, the algorithm, cannot be protected by copyright laws, at least as I mentioned in the continental European approaches, whereas once it is expressed as code written in software, then it can be protected. But the problem with that protection is, and that's why many people call copyright part of what we call soft IP, the problem is you can grant the protection only to the expression of the code, but not to its functionalities. So if someone has looked at the functionalities, but is able to express these functionalities in a different way, there will be no copyright infringement. So contemporary copyright laws in continental Europe do not really afford a very valid protection to what we do here. By the way, you can take pictures, but I understand. No, you go ahead. But it's going to be distributed. I know this is part of the new presentation, as I mentioned, but it's going to be distributed. So you're going to have it. Another thing to consider is in IP, in copyright, it requires human developing. So the intellectual creation must be done by a human. And obviously, if you're talking the protection of artificial intelligence as such, that's not problematic. It's still a computer programmer writing a program. So it's a human. It must be individual. So here the test typically is, would somebody else have done it differently? And if that is the case, you have passed the threshold, and then it's copyrightable. And it's we have the moral rights, so it's always the person has to be identified, the person that is the author of the copyright. So now if you look at the protection of the product of AI, and that's Doris' turf, but I will briefly touch it, and maybe we have different perspectives. So many national copyright laws grant copyright protection only to works created by humans. That applies to Switzerland, to Germany, I believe to France. I think only in the UK, to my knowledge, there is a regime that is slightly different. And there, it's the person by whom the arrangements necessary for the creation of the work are undertaken. That is regarded as the author enjoying copyright protection of the computer-generated work. There has so far no case law made on this regulation, but it could mean that the person operating the computer is deemed to be the author of the computer-generated work. I think that would make sense, and I don't think it's a revolution. We already had that before, even when a person performed very closely the instructions of someone else. And that would be, the computer performing the instructions and the arrangements of someone else. Not the person executing these orders, but the person giving the orders would be deemed the copyright author. So I think that's nothing really new, and I think that's a very appropriate way to address the problem. So now let's go to patent law. And here, if you look at the protection of AI as such, and we know software, getting a patent in software has become a large obstacle. It's very difficult nowadays, not only in Europe, where it has always been very difficult, but lately also in the US. By the way, do we have any people here from the US or other areas that are not part of the EU? Do we have, yeah? Where? All right. Do we have any people from Brexit country? No? Okay, anyway. All right. So, but software can indeed be patentable if it fulfills the conditions. So the invention must be it must include a technical rule. So the software needs a technical effect. Software as such is not patentable. That's part of the EPC. It must be novel, so it must augment the current status of technology by an inventive step. It must be non-obvious, so an expert looking at the current status of technology should say, well, this is taking it a step further, and only the technical elements are patentable. There is no patent protection for pure programming routines. And also the disclosure and practicability is a condition. There must be a description of the invention so that it can be replicated. So if you look at the protection of the product of AI from a patent law perspective, first of all, one of the obstacles is only humans can be inventors in the sense of patent law, and only a person can acquire the right to file a patent application. So the question is, does pushing the button, does that suffice? There's no particular cases analyzing under which conditions humans interacting with cognitive systems might be considered the inventors of technical teachings created with assistance of cognitive systems. But I would say to be deemed a co-inventor, it might be sufficient to recognize in some material a technical teaching that solves a technical problem. So when the cognitive engine results is you run into a result that gives you a new insight to your former business processes and gives you maybe new hints what could be done. It could be sufficient if to recognize that, and then it is sort of a new view of what could be done. And with this approach, you could consider the cognitive system the scientific tool providing some output. So that would be a solution, but I think it's still quite difficult to get that. But I don't think that the current patent laws need to be really amended. I think with that approach, you can solve pretty much everything. So let's have a practical look at what happens when we do deals in that field. And here, I think it's important that we start a project with our what we call Watson core. And what is that? That is a complex system of software programs that are copyrighted, of algorithms that have been developed by us that are also being used in conjunction with the software programs. And very typically, the software program, as mentioned, is an expression of the algorithm. And that is the unique product of an innovative and very expensive process within a company. So that belongs to the provider of the AI service. So that's something that, for instance, IBM, but also our competitors, claim for themselves. What we want to give to our clients is the possibility to run their unique data, and I think that's very important to state. The client data is the most important thing. So they, for very good reason, call it their crown jewels. So it's the gold of our modern economy, or the oil of our modern economy, and they want to have it safeguarded. So we are here to use it only in a very strict and limited sense of a particular project. We are almost never allowed to use it elsewhere, obviously, because data, that type of information has become a currency. So it is of ultimate value, and so we preserve that. Typically, when the project is done, we give it back or we delete it, depending on our contractual obligations. But this is something that the client wants to safeguard. On the other hand, if it's a client from the chemical industry, what we want to maintain and preserve is our freedom of action. So we have developed that new business model that we apply, and we are a commercial company, so we want to use it for other projects. We want to commercially exploit it in an indefinite number of projects, theoretically. So what we want to be able is, if a competitor from the same industry, chemical industry, comes with its own set of data, also very, very, very valid data, very proprietary, very important, we have the same technical measures to protect it, we have the same organizational measures to protect it, and we have the same contractual safeguards that help the client, so that we really treat it as it would be our own data, or even more diligently. But we want to be able to use the data of someone else, different set of data, maybe with even similar questions, and run that data through our cognitive engine, and provide different results. But it could also be the same results. That really depends. So there is a certain likelihood, at least if it's a smaller set of data, and if it's a smaller set of questions that you would like to extract from and get analyzed by the cognitive engine, there may be a likelihood, if it's the same area of business, that the insights, the results that the cognitive engine produces could be quite similar, but it comes from a different source, from a different set of data. So we want to preserve that freedom of action. That is very important. Without that, I think the entire business model wouldn't work. So we couldn't do that. So the output, the final output, could be new insights of a chemical process. And that, again, is then something that is typically also part of the negotiations. Of course, the clients want to have a competitive advantage towards its competition, so many times they, of course, want to claim that for themselves. And so these results, that's machine-generated data. As mentioned, from a copyright perspective, it will be difficult in continental Europe to do something, to have a copyright on that. In the UK, I think it's a different story. When it comes to patent law, we also have some possibilities, but probably more restrictions. But that's up to the client. They can typically, depending on the contractual arrangements, they can do with that what they want, and very often the possibilities they have are more on the contractual side, so they have to reserve that contractually. At least what they always have is typically a competitive advantage on the timeline, because the sooner they employ a cognitive engine provider, the sooner they have the results. On the other hand, of course, some may wait because they think, well, maybe we wait until the market is more mature. That's another story. So it's a delicate balance to take. How are we in terms of time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, thank you. That's fine. So maybe that slide is showing how these areas can be described. So whatever you see that is circled in blue color, that is what we look at as IBM owned, and that's in particular that box that you see in the middle, the magic box, the cognitive engine. That's IBM Watson, and so we have analytics, natural language processing, APIs. That's basically what IBM has brought as a tool to the project. Then it's the models and the algorithms. And then by the constant interaction with the client data, but also with other data that we may feed also into the cognitive engine, there will be enhancements. And you need to understand that all that I'm describing here is currently done on the cloud, and with really a large capacity of data processing. So the cognitive engine is constantly developing. So by the second, whenever there is an interaction between the cognitive engine and the data, when that happens, as I said, there is constant thinking of the machine. There is constant feeding of the machine. Whenever there is an interaction, it will be not the same, so it will enhance. And from a copyright perspective, if it's the software code, that would be a derivative work, and be it under continental European copyright laws or also in the United States, it's always the copyright owner that will be the owner of the derivative works. Do we have any Germans here? All right, so ein Werk zweiter Hand. I don't know how, in Espanol, how do you call it? ¿Qué es en español? Es un derivatif, un derecho derivatif, posiblemente? Un derivado, okay, bueno. All right, so that's what it is from a copyright perspective. As I mentioned, on the right-hand corner at the bottom, you see the proprietary client content. That's where it all starts. You have annotated content that's typically done in conjunction. There you have probably not joint ownership because it really cannot be owned, but both parties reserve a certain exclusivity to it. And there are other sources. There are some publicly available databases, for instance, in the medical fields, and to the extent that is possible, of course, the more non-contaminated data you have that you can feed into a cognitive engine, the more accurate the results will be. I just mentioned the term non-contaminated. I think that's very important because obviously also in that field of the economy, the principle is garbage in, garbage out. So if the data is being contaminated or not accurate, the results will neither be very solid. So that's very important to keep in mind. So, and I have mentioned the result that basically is the output of the cognitive engine. That's what you see here. That's always what the client wants. That's why he did the project. He wants to have new insights into its business processes. And as mentioned, that could be owned, maybe not, in many cases not from a legal perspective, but it is in the exclusivity of the client. So they have this advantage, that competitive advantage towards its competitors. Nevertheless, as I mentioned also, IBM wants to preserve the freedom of action to do, not with that set of data, but with a different set of data, the same stuff. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. Now, because I spoke a lot about data, I think let's go a little bit to the core of data. And maybe that would be a need for another conference, but obviously in many jurisdictions people are now talking the possibilities to exploit data and to have ownership in data. And in most areas in Europe that is still not possible. You cannot own data. And personally I think it would be too early, too premature to do something here. Typically we need to distinguish between commercial data and personal data. And here I think it's also important to state that if it's personal data, the value may not necessarily be the commercial value. The value may be that the way your data is being treated concerns your personal integrity. So it's more a moral thing. So you want to maintain your options. You want to maintain to whom your data is being disclosed and all that. So it's much more than just ownership in a commercial sense. But in order to exploit the data, there are some voices out there looking for an even better commercial protection of data, and that's ownership concepts. And I haven't seen that yet happening, and as mentioned, I would be cautious here. I don't think it's really necessary. But interestingly, in the US Driver Privacy Act of 2015, you have something like that. And I don't know to what extent that was really meant to start a policy-making policy question, but if you look at the wording here, it is indeed any data in an event data recorder required to be installed in a passenger motor vehicle concerning the collection, storage, and retrievability of onboard motor vehicle crash event data is the property of the owner or lessee of the vehicle. So it's the property. And there's no, to my knowledge, there is no further basis where that property concept came. So it's quite an interesting finding. And I don't know how it evolved since then. But obviously, as I mentioned, data itself is a currency nowadays, and there are some companies out there, namely Facebook or also Google, where data is basically all they need. So it's the most important thing that drives their business. So what are the things that you should consider with industrial Internet of Things or AI data? So you need to think about the data, metadata that will be generated by the device. You have to ask yourself, will the device generate, transmit, and store telematics data regarding its performance, conditions, and locations? You will have to think about how much data and metadata will be sent to you. By the way, metadata is just data about data. So it is basically explaining what's in the first set of data. You will have to think about whether you will anonymize the data or not, and that's in today's with today's technical possibilities. Anonymizing data is a very difficult task. Even if you believe it's anonymized, it may be, with the technical possibilities we have, it may be possible with just a few steps to de-anonymize it. So whenever you're being confronted with someone telling you the data is fully anonymized, you, I think, as a natural reaction, should challenge that and verify that whether that's really the case. Bottom line is, and also the GDPR hasn't changed that, to the extent that the data subject is not identifiable, then it is anonymized. But the identification with today's means has gotten much simpler. So here you need to be cautious, and the development will never stop, so there will be always more possibilities. Think of quantum computing, which is now just another buzzword and another technology that is being discussed in the media. It will even take it a few notches above in a few years, I believe. It's going to make it even faster, and you can solve the most complex problems one at a time. Whereas before, even with the best computers, you will do it step by step, and then you can do it in real time altogether. So it will also produce new challenges to data anonymization and to encryption and decryption. With that, I think we could start the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.